Hello. Yes, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening to you, wherever you are. Today, I've got a very interesting person with me. Now, it was once said that everybody has at least one novel in them. And today, my guest today he's actually had at least 20 novels. I'm very pleased to say, in the studio today, I've got the celebrated author, and also, he's also been around the world doing novels, but especially a lot of them in Thailand. I've got Stephen Leather with me today. Good morning, or good evening, or good afternoon, and welcome.
Hi, nice to see you.
Stephen, I've really been looking forward to this meeting for quite a while, and in preparation, I've been reading some of your novels. Just tell us how you actually got started writing.
I've always wanted to write. My uncle was a TV writer. He worked for a show called The Avengers, and wrote for Department S, The Champions, a whole load of shows that went out in the 60s. So I'd always seen his working lifestyle and quite envied that. My parents wanted me to be a doctor, so I got shuffled off into science. I was actually working as a biochemist for a while. I also had a job in a pub, and one night in a pub met a journalist and decided, after talking to him for a few hours after the bar had shut, that I really wanted to be a journalist. But I think behind it all, I always wanted to be a writer. Journalism was a way of getting into writing so that I could eventually write books one day.
So how long ago was that?
I was probably 20 when I met the journalist. I managed to get out of biochemistry and worked for various newspapers. Was trained as a journalist by the Daily Mirror, worked for the Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail, worked for the Times. For a while was business editor of the South China Morning Post out in Hong Kong. Working as a journalist and enjoying it, doing really well, but at the same time writing novels. And then when I was on the Daily Mirror, wrote my first novel, which was I was lucky enough to have published by Collins. Wrote 3 books as a journalist, and then my 4th book, The Chinaman, did really well, and I was able to do it full time. So I've been writing full time as a book writer, as it were, for 20 years now.
The first book you wrote was Payoff. How did it feel when you saw that in print?
It's funny, it doesn't feel that great. You think it would be like some sort of great relief or great joy, and it doesn't work like that. And the reason is because of the time sequence of a book. You write a book and you finish it, and you write the words, the end, but it hasn't really been finished. That's the first draft. You then have to reread it, do it again, correct it, get a second draft. You've then got to try and get it published, or the stage I'm at now, I know it's going to be published, but before it gets published, it gets edited. It gets edited by a senior editor who'll give you broad brush strokes on how the book has to be improved. So it's given back to you, you rewrite it, it goes back to the company, to the publishers. They then get it what's called line edited, where someone goes through every line, every word, everything you've written gets checked and double checked. Your punctuation is corrected. It comes back to you, you read it, you check that you're happy with the corrections that have been made, and then it goes out to be typeset. And that brings with it a whole other set of problems in that the typesetter will then make mistakes, so you've got to read his work and check it. So finally, probably 3 months after you've written the end, you actually get to see the final version. Then you'll get to see the cover. Still doesn't really feel finished because you haven't seen the book. Then the book arrives, but you get the book about 2 or 3 months before it's in the shops. So you've got a copy of the book. And I think when you get the first copy of it, there's a bit of a thrill. But by then, you're already working on the next one, because this is 4 or 5 months after you've finished it. You're then halfway through the next one. So you're so busy thinking about the book you're writing on, there's no real sense of enjoyment. So it's funny, most writers I know, we never crack open a bottle of champagne. There's never, ever any celebratory dinner. You'll celebrate with your editor and with the publisher on the day of publication, and that's maybe a big day. But even that's a sort of false day, because the book's normally in the shops 2 or 3 weeks before the publication date. So it's funny, there is no great feeling of joy with writing. It really does become, treadmill's the wrong word, but it's an ongoing process, so there's never any great feeling of joy.
I read in your website that you have a feeling that agents are a lot of hard work, but a necessity.
You've got to have an agent these days. When I started, you didn't need an agent. When I started, 23 years ago, you could just send a book into a publisher. They would read it. If it was good, you'd get published. And that's what happened to me. I sent it to 5 publishing companies. 2 were interested, and Collins published me. These days, publishing companies don't have the time to do it. Part of that is because it's so much easier to write a book these days, because of the technology, because you've got computers, because you've got grammar correcting and spell checking programs. It's easier to write a book. When I wrote my first book, most of it was by hand. Then I typed it out in a typewriter. And if you made a mistake, you had to retype the page. Nowadays, you just backspace and correct. As a result of that, it's easier to write a book, so more people are doing it, so therefore it's harder to separate the wheat from the chaff, from the gold from the dross, as it were. And publishing companies have now given up on that. It used to be called a slush pile, which was the pile of unsolicited manuscripts. Publishing companies don't have slush piles anymore. You have to have an agent, and it's very, very difficult to get an agent. It takes a lot of time, a lot of perseverance. Agents have fewer staff than publishing houses, so it's even harder for them to find a good book. I mean, all my editing friends tell me the same, that if a book is good, it will get published eventually. But there's no doubt it's a lot harder than it was than when I started.
When you first started and you did Payoff and The Fireman, you were still working as a full-time journalist. Was that hard work?
Oh no, I enjoyed being a journalist, and also working as a journalist, it really fires up your adrenaline. You're working to tight deadlines. You know, you're certainly working for Fleet Street newspapers. There's a lot of intense pressure, and what I would do is I would use that adrenaline. So after I'd finished my shift, I'd go home, and the adrenaline would still be coursing through you, and I'd sit down and I'd write 500 words, 1,000 words of my novel. So it wasn't difficult. It was mainly a money thing. I mean, I got a very small amount of money for my first book. I think Payoff, Collins paid me £1,000. I sold American rights for $3,000, which back then was £2,000, and the Japanese, for some reason, bought it for $5,000, which would have been £2,500. So my total income from the book was £6,000, which certainly wasn't enough to give up my day job. It wasn't until I wrote my fourth book, The Chinaman, that I got enough money to be able to do it full time, and I've been doing it full time since.
Was that a big decision then, to actually give up a permanent flow of money?
Yeah, I was on the Times, and a new editor had been appointed, Simon Jenkins, and he was meeting all the members of his staff and all the journalists on a sort of daily basis. He'd meet 3 or 4 of them separately, just to say welcome and to find out what we wanted to do. And I went in and shook his hand and sat down and said, "Well, a bit embarrassing, I've just written a book and I've got to resign, I've got to leave." And he spent about 20 minutes talking me out of it, explaining that, you know, journalism, if you like, was a real job. Writing books is a bit hit and miss. Just because you've been offered a decent book contract doesn't mean you're going to be a professional book writer for 20 years. The tipping point for me was the fact that if I'd stayed on my job on the Times, I would have paid more in income tax on the book money than I would have earned from the Times. So I would effectively have been working for the government. My staff job at 50, 60 hours a week was what I was working, would have gone straight to pay off my tax bill for the books I was writing. So it made more sense to leave and to give up the job and to write full time. And I've never regretted it. I mean, I've had friends who stayed on as journalists who are now doing much better than I am financially. My boss on the Daily Mail, which is my sort of third newspaper ago, is now the editor, and he's earning sort of well over £1 million a year, and he's doing very nicely. So, it's swings and roundabouts. I enjoy writing fiction, but a lot of my friends are still journalists, and I do envy them their lifestyle. Being a journalist is a great job.
Most of the people watching today will know you from Private Dancer. Do you think that was the one book that people relate with you so much? Simply because it was available on the internet?
It's funny, I'm known for it in Thailand and probably in Southeast Asia. Back in the UK, I don't think anyone would be aware of Private Dancer or that I'd written it. It's very much a niche market. It's been a very successful book. I mean, it was online, and I think it got downloaded about 60,000 times over 4 or 5 years. I've just done, 12 print run, and we're up to about 36,000 copies in print, which is very good for a self-published book. I'd say in Asia I'm known for it. I'm saying certainly in Pattaya, most people who've been here in a length of time would have read it. And another book I wrote called Confessions of a Bangkok Private Eye is also mine, and most people would know me for those 2 books.
I know that when I first came over to Thailand and I was speaking to people about living over here, they said you must have a copy of Private Dancer with you if you're going to Pattaya. So I think it's part of people's their emergency pack when they come to Thailand is to be forewarned and forearmed by your book.
The thing about Private Dancer is it was written before the internet. The world has changed now. Anyone who's thinking of coming to Thailand, all they've got to do is go to a search engine, put in Thailand Pattaya bars, and you'll get thousands of websites telling you what's going on here. When I wrote Private Dancer, no one knew what was going on here. And my briefing before I went to a go-go bar was I was working in Hong Kong. My boss had come over and he'd gone to Pat Pong, and he gave me like a 30-minute chat about, go to this bar, do this is what happens, da-da-da. And you walk into that environment and you're like a newborn babe. You've no idea what's going on. That doesn't happen these days. These days you can go to the internet and be